Well, this is it. The last two chapters of Island of the Blue Dolphins by Scott Odell, 28 and 29. Let's see what happens. The earthquake did little damage. Even the spring, which failed to flow for several days, started up again and flowed more than ever. But the great waves had cost me all the food and weapons which were stored in the cave. That's a big toll right there. It also took the canoe I had been working on, and also those hidden under the south cliffs. The canoes were the biggest loss. To find enough wood to make another one would take all spring and summer. I therefore set out on the first fair morning to search for whatever wreckage the waves had washed ashore. Well, that's smart. She might find parts of the canoe. Among the rocks near the south cliffs, I found a part of one canoe, buried in the sand and twisted in kelp. I worked all morning to dig it free, and then, having scraped it clean, could not decide what to do. I could cut the sinews and carry the planks, because remember, it's really heavy, up the cliff 2 at a time, on my back and across the dunes to Coral Cove, which meant many days, or I could build the canoe here on the rocks and take the chance that another storm would maybe wash it away before I was finished. You know, would she do that back-breaking labor to keep it safe, or just construct the canoe right there on the beach and run the risk that a wave could take it away? Oh boy, what to do? I finally did neither of those things. Choosing a day when the sea was calm, I floated what was left of the canoe and, pushing it in front of me, made my way past the sand spit into the cove. There I took the wreckage apart and moved the planks up the trail beyond the place where the great waves had reached. Smart. I found the remains of my other canoe. It had been washed far back in the cave, and I could not get it out. So I went back to the south cliffs and hunted among the piles of kelp until I had enough pieces of wood, counting what I already had, to begin building another. It was late in the spring now. The weather was still unsettled, with light rain falling most of the days, but I started the new canoe anyway, for I needed it to gather shellfish. No longer did I think of the Aleuts, as I have said, yet without a canoe to go where I wanted, I felt uneasy. The planks were all about the same size, the length of my arm, but they came from different canoes and were therefore hard to fit together. The holes were ready, however, which saved me much labor and time. She wouldn't have to bore holes to, fit the slats together. Another help was the great waves had washed ashore long strings of black pitch. That's what you stick in the cracks. And it was often difficult to find that on the island, but I needed it. When I had sorted out the planks and shaped them, the work went fast, so that by late spring I was ready to finish the seams. It was on a windy morning that I made a fire to soften the pitch. The wind was cold, and it took a long time to get the fire going. To hasten it, I went down to the beach to find some dry seaweed. I had started back with my arms filled when I turned to look at the sky, thinking from the feel of the wind that a storm might be close. Off to the north, the skies were clear, but in the east, from whence storms sometimes came on this season, stood banks of gray clouds, one on top of the other. At this moment, in the deep shadows cast by the clouds, I saw something else. Forgetting that I was carrying a load of seaweed, I threw up my arms, and the seaweed fell to the ground. A sail. A ship was there on the sea, halfway between the horizon and the shore. By the time I had reached the headland, it was much closer, moving quickly on the strong wind. I could see that it did not have the red beak prow of the Aleuts. That's good. Nor did it look like the white men's ship, which I clearly remembered. But here comes a ship into Coral Cove. Why had it come to the island of the Blue Dolphins? I crouched on the headland and wondered, my heart beating fast. If they were hunters, I must hide before they saw me. They would soon find my fire and the canoe I was making, yet I could go to the cave and probably be safe from them. But if they had been sent by my people to take me away, then I should not hide. The ship moved slowly between the black rocks into Coral Cove, and I could see the men now, and they were not Aleuts. They lowered a canoe, and 2 of the men paddled toward the beach. The wind had begun to blow hard, and the men had trouble landing. Finally, one of them stayed behind in the canoe, and the other, the man without a beard, jumped into the water and came along the beach and up the trail. I could not see him, but after a while I heard a shout, then another, and I knew they had found my fire and the canoe. The man he had left in the cove did not answer, nor did the men on the ship, so I was sure that he was calling to me. I crawled down from the rock and went to the house. Since my shoulders were bare, I put on my otter cape. I took my cormorant skirt and the abalone box in which I kept my necklace and earrings. With Rontuaru, I went along the trail that led to Coral Cove. I came to the mound where the ancestors sometimes camped in the summer. I thought of them and of the happy time spent in my house on the headland, of my canoe lying unfinished beside the trail. I thought of many things, but stronger was the wish to be where my people lived, to hear their voices, to hear their laughter. I left the mound and the green grass growing on it among the white shells. I could no longer hear the man calling, so I began to run. When I came to the place where the 2 trails met, where I had built my fire, I found the footsteps the man had left. I followed them down to the cove. The canoe had gone back to the ship. The wind was screaming now, and mist blew in across the harbor, and waves began to pile up on the shore, and I raised my hand and shouted. I shouted over and over, but the wind carried my voice away. I ran down the beach and waded into the water. The men did not see me. Rain started to fall, and the wind drove it against my face. I waded farther out through the waves, raising my arms to the ship, but slowly it moved away in the mist. It went toward the south. I stood there until it was out of sight. Okay, chapter 29. After 2 more springs had gone, so a couple years, on a morning of white clouds and calm seas, the same ship came back. At dawn, I saw it from the headland far out on the horizon. When the sun was overhead, it lay anchored in Coral Cove. Until the sun went down, I watched from the headland while the men made a camp on the shore and built a fire. Then I went to my house. All night I didn't sleep, thinking of the man who once had called to me. I had thought of his voice calling for a long time, since the night of the storm when the ship had sailed away. Every day during those 2 springs and 2 summers, I had gone to the headland and watched, although always at dawn, again at dusk. But there was never a ship. In the morning I smelled smoke from their fire. I went down to the ravine and bathed in the spring and put on my otter cape and my cormorant skirt. The skirt she made of cormorant feathers. I put on the necklace of black stones Tutok had given her, and the black earrings that she had made to go with the necklace from Tutok. With blue clay, I made the mark of our tribe across my nose. She wanted to identify herself with her people. Then I did something that made me smile at myself. I did what my older sister Ulapi had done when she left the island of the Blue Dolphins. Below the mark of our tribe, I carefully made the sign which meant I was still unmarried. I was no longer a girl, yet I made it anyway because the blue clay and some white clay for the dots. So she used the blue clay and white clay for dots, and it made it known that she had not been married. "We're going away," I said to Rontuaru. She built a fire and cooked food for him. I wasn't hungry. He ate my food too. But he only put his head to one side, as his father often had done, and when I said no more, he trotted out to a sunny place and lay down and fell asleep. Now that the white men had come back, I could not think of what I would do when I went across the sea, or make a picture in my mind of the white men and what they did there, or see my people who had gone so long ago, nor think of the past. Thinking of the past, of the many summers and winters and springs, and they had all gone by. I couldn't see them. They were all one. A tight feeling in my breast was all I felt at that moment. The morning was full of sun. The wind smelled of the sea and the things that lived in it. Probably a little bit of a fishy smell, but very pleasant. I saw the men long before they saw the house on the headland, far off on the dunes to the south. There were 3 of them, 2 tall men and one who was short and wore a long gray robe. He was a priest from the mission Santa Barbara. They left the dunes and came along the cliff, and then seeing the smoke from the fire which I kept burning, they followed it and at last reached my house. I crawled under the fence and stood facing them. The man in the gray robe had a string of beads around his neck, and at the end it was an ornament of polished wood, which was, of course, a cross. She had never seen that. He raised his hand and made a motion toward me, which was in the shape of the ornament he saw. Priests will sometimes bless people by making the sign of the cross. So they'll go like this. And that's what he did to her when he saw her. Then one of the 2 men who stood behind him spoke to me. His words made the strangest sounds I've ever heard. At first I wanted to laugh, but I bit my tongue. I shook my head and smiled at him. He spoke again slowly this time, and though his words sounded the same as before and meant nothing to me, they now seemed sweet. They were the sound of a human voice. There's no sound like this in all the world. The man lifted his hand and pointed toward the cove and made a picture in the air of what could have been a ship. To this I nodded, and myself pointed to the 3 baskets that I had placed by the fire, making a gesture of taking them to the ship. Also the cage in which I put the 2 young birds. There were many gestures before we left, though the 2 men spoke among themselves. They liked my necklace, the cape, the cormorant skirt that shone in the sun, but when we got to the beach where their camp was, the first thing the man who spoke the most did was to tell the other men to make me a dress. I knew this was what he said because one of them stood in front of me and held up a string from my neck to my feet and across my shoulders. The dress was blue. It was made of 2 trousers, just like those the white men were wearing. The trousers were cut into pieces, and then one of the men sat down on the rock and put them together again with white string. He had a long nose, which looked like the needle he used. He sat all afternoon on the rock, and the needle went back and forth, in and out, flashing in the sun. From time to time, he would hold up the dress and nod his head as if he were pleased. I nodded as if I were pleased too, but I was not. I wanted to wear my cormorant skirt and my otter cape, which were more beautiful than the thing he was making. The dress reached from my throat to my feet, and I didn't like it. I didn't like it, either the color of it or the way it scratched. It was so hot. But I smiled and put my cormorant skirt away in one of the baskets to wear when I got across the sea, sometime when the men were not around. The ship stayed in Coral Cove 9 days. It had come for otter, but the otter had gone. Some must have been left, after all, who remembered the aleuts, for on that morning there were none to be seen. When they saw the ship, they got out of there. I knew where they had gone. They had gone to Tall Rock. But when the men showed me the weapons that they had brought to kill the otter, I shook my head and acted as though I didn't understand. They pointed to my otter cape, but I still shook my head. I asked them about the ship that had taken my people away many years before, making the signs of the ship and pointing to the east, but they didn't understand. Not until I came to Mission Santa Barbara and met Father Gonzalez did I learn from him that this ship had sunk in a great storm soon after it reached his country, and that on the whole ocean thereabouts there was no other. For this reason, the white men had not come back for me. On the 10th day we sailed. It was a morning of blue skies and no wind. We went straight toward the sun. For a long time I stood and looked back at the island of blue dolphins. The last thing I saw of it was the high headland. I thought of Rontu lying there beneath the stones of many colors, and of Wanani, wherever she was, and the little red fox that would scratch in vain at my fence, and my canoe hidden in the cave, and of all the happy days. Dolphins rose out of the sea and swam before the ship. They swam for many leagues in the morning through the bright water, weaving their foamy patterns. The little birds were chirping in their cage, and Rontu Aru sat beside me. And that's the end of Island of the Blue Dolphins. Of course, I've mentioned it before. Once our heroine was rescued from the Island of the Blue Dolphins and taken across the channel into the mainland, Santa Barbara. That's where Captain Nidover took her to live at his home with he and his wife. She only lived 7 weeks and got sick with dysentery. She just didn't have immunities because she had never been around certain things that the rest of the population had and had built up immunity to. So sad to say she didn't live very long. But in those days, there are some stories, if you want to research, that you can find on YouTube. And she was indeed, for 18 years, lived on the Island of the Blue Dolphins, and very brave woman. Did a great job taking care of herself. And for a time, a young man who possibly was her son. I think maybe the first 8-9 years, maybe somewhere in between in the middle of those 18 years, she lost him and then was alone. And because there's thoughts from what there's some of the evidence that he didn't want to get on the ship, she stayed on the Island of the Blue Dolphins with him. But once he died, she was free to go, and she was willing to go. Island of the Blue Dolphins, Scott Odell. What a great book.